Okay, now we come to Asoka. According to the Sri Lankan records, the Buddha died in the 8th year of the reign of King Ajatasattu of Magadha. And then the King Ajatasattu's dynasty continued for several generations until the last king was called King Nagadasakala. That means when the Magadha, this dynasty was still strong. So later the Susunaga dynasty started, but lasted a very short time. And then after that the Nanda dynasty started and endured for 22 years. And then in the year 327 BCE, Alexander the Great conquered northwest India. After he conquered into India, there was a lot of disorder. Following the resulting disorder, Chandragupta became king and founded the Mauryan dynasty. He established a strong kingdom over much of India and ruled for 24 years. Then, after Chandragupta, his son was King Bindusara. And this King Bindusara ruled for 28 years. And Bindusara's son was Asoka. Asoka became king in the year 268 BCE. This one, almost all scholars accept this date. Why? Because during the time of Emperor Asoka, he sent missionaries to spread the Dhamma. And he sent missionaries to spread the Dhamma in different countries. And this was recorded in the Asoka pillars. The Emperor Asoka, he constructed stone pillars where the Dhamma was carved out, and also some of the things that happened at that time. So it is mentioned that he sent missionaries to such and such countries, and the kings of the countries were mentioned. So from there, historians, they look and they see such and such a king lived at what time, what year, and then they came to the conclusion that the King Asoka became king in the year 268. So Sri Lankan records say that 218 years passed between the time the Buddha died and the time Asoka became king. But Chinese books say differently. But strangely enough, there is one book in the Chinese records, chronicles. It's called the Ai Wang Chuan, the King Asoka records or King Asoka biography. And there it is stated that from the Buddha's time until Emperor Asoka's time, there were 12 kings of Magadha. Even though the dynasty had stopped, they still had this king. So 12 kings lived from the Buddha's time until the Emperor Asoka's time. Now, just now we mentioned that certain kings, they ruled for 24 years, 28 years, and Asoka himself was king for 36 years. You know, once a person becomes a king, he does not retire, he does not take pension until he dies. Usually that's the case. So that's why most kings, they will rule for 20-something years or 30-something years until they die. That being the case, if 12 kings passed from the time of the Buddha until Asoka, so 200 over years is a reasonable record, but reasonable period. But the Chinese books say only 100 years passed between the time of Emperor Asoka and the Buddha's passing away. In other words, they don't acknowledge that the Buddha passed away around the year 485 BCE. They think it was actually 100 years later, that means around 385 BCE now. And one of the reasons they give is that they say when the Buddha passed away, he transmitted his teachings to Mahakassapa. He transmitted his teachings to Mahakassapa. And then Mahakassapa transmitted his teachings to Ananda. And then who transmitted it to Sanakavasi, to Upagupta, to Ditika. So in other words, there were 5 generations of monks from the time of the Buddha's passing away until Asoka. But then you must know that this is not in the suttas. This is only what they say. For example, when they say that the Buddha transmitted his leadership of the Sangha to Mahakassapa, we find the suttas, this is not correct. Because when the Buddha was about to pass away, the Venerable Ananda asked the Buddha, said, Bhagawa, after you are gone, whom should we follow as our teacher? And the Buddha said, after I am gone, take the Dhamma and the Vinaya that I have taught as your teacher. So the Buddha did not say that to follow another monk as his teacher. The Buddha said to follow his teachings as the real teacher. Whereas the Mahayana books, they say differently. Now, the Mahayana books also say that at the time of Emperor Asoka, there were only 2 sects of Buddhism. It's only after the time of Emperor Asoka that the 18 other schools formed. But in the Sri Lankan records, the 18 additional schools already formed by the time of King Asoka. Also, it is mentioned in the Sri Lankan records that because of the many wrong views that King Asoka saw among the monks, that he asked a very respected monk called Mogali Putta Tissa Thera to convene the third council of monks, and then to recite the true Dhamma, and then to tell them what is wrong, what is right. And also those monks who did not follow the true Dhamma, who had wrong views, this Mogali Putta Tissa Thera was asked to defrock the monks, disrobe the monks. So, now if you think that if all this happened 100 years after Emperor Asoka's time, if Mogali Putta Tissa Thera tried to disrobe the monks, I don't think they would have allowed him to disrobe. They would probably have fought with him, right? It's only, to my mind, he could only do that because King Asoka directed him to do it. King Asoka was behind him. Because of the king's power, the monks could be disrobed. But if King Asoka was not around, and this happened 100 years later, if any monk tried to disrobe another monk, they would definitely not listen to him, right? So also, it is stated in the Sri Lankan records that the second Sangha Council, where the basic schism happened in Vesali, where the monks of Vesali was not practicing well, and the 700 monks convened the second Sangha Council. It is mentioned in the Sri Lankan records that this happened at the time of King Kala Asoka. In other words, at that time, 100 years after the Buddha's passing away, there was a king called Kala Asoka. And then the third council, which was held during the time of Emperor Asoka, was another 118 years later. So, you see from here that the Chinese records have no knowledge that 2 Asoka kings existed. They did not know of the existence of Kala Asoka. They only know of one Asoka only. This famous Asoka, sometimes is called this King Asoka, or sometimes it is called Dhamma Asoka, because he ruled according to Dhamma. So sometimes they call him Dhamma Asoka. So because they did not have this knowledge that there was another Asoka, most probably they confused these two Asokas and thought they were the same person. That's why you find that they say that this all this happened 100 years after the Buddha's passing away. So from here we can see most probably why the Chinese records have it wrong. Now I'd like to talk a bit about King Asoka. It is stated that the Buddhism of King Asoka is closer to early Buddhism than to sectarian Buddhism or Hinayana Buddhism. It's also stated that Asoka converted to Buddhism in the 7th year of his reign. 7 years after he became king, he became a Buddhist. But in the 8th year of his reign, he conquered a country called Kalinga. And when he conquered this country, the people fought very fiercely. So a lot of people died. And in this war, he saw a lot of suffering. Families were separated. Members of the family were separated. Sometimes a family lost a mother. Sometimes a family lost a father. And they had great difficulty to continue living, to find a livelihood. So because he saw also so many people killed and disfigured, maimed and all that, so he regretted that he started this war. From that time onwards, he did not want to conduct any more wars. Then he started to practice the Buddha's teaching seriously. He believed that compassion was very important. So he kept the 8 precepts. He went to the monasteries to do his retreats and all these things. And then it is stated from the 12th year until the 27th year that he became king, he made great effort to spread the Buddha's teachings. And how did he make effort to spread the Buddha's teachings? One was by erecting these stone pillars, what they are called Asokan edicts. These stone pillars, he asked the people to carve the words of the Buddha on these stone pillars, and also a lot of other things that he thought was important, his ideas about compassion and all these things. And also he sent monks, missionaries to other countries to spread the Dhamma to nearby countries, like now what we know as Pakistan, Afghanistan and all that. At that time were Buddhist countries. And then he liked to make this Dhamma Yatras. Dhamma Yatras means Dhamma tours. In these Dhamma tours, he'll go to various parts of India, and when he went to various places, he will visit monks, especially well-known or good practicing monks. He go and see monks, and then also he will do dana, either offer food and robes and all that to the monks, or do dana to poor people, help the poor people. Also, he would teach Dhamma to the masses, to the ordinary people, taught them to practice the Dhamma correctly, etc. Now, since we know that during the Empress Asoka's time, we still have the original Buddhism, we look at the stone pillars that he constructed, then we get a good idea what is original Buddhism. In the stone pillars that he constructed, it is mentioned that there are 5 Nikayas. The Buddha's teachings, at that time already, there were 5 Nikayas. One is the Digha Nikaya, another is the Majjhima Nikaya, Sangyutta Nikaya, Anguttara Nikaya. The last was the Khuddaka Nikaya. Khuddaka Nikaya means the collection, the minor collection. That means those few suttas that could not fit into the Digha, Majjhima or Samyutta or Anguttara Nikaya, they were put into the Khuddaka Nikaya. So you note carefully, this is original Buddhism, the 5 Nikayas. But then the last Khuddaka Nikaya, later monks started to add more and more books to the Khuddaka Nikaya. So from a minor collection, now it has become a major collection. A lot of books, much more than the other Nikayas. So the first 4 Nikayas, Digha, Majjhima, Samyutta and Anguttara Nikaya can be reliably said to be the original words of the Buddha. Now, the Asoka, he taught the people to practice the Dhamma well, especially compassion and sincerity. And needless killing was prohibited. He even made laws that if animals were to be killed, pregnant animals should not be killed. And also nursing animals, those that had just given birth, those female animals which need to give milk to the young, they were not allowed to be killed. And then hospitals were built for people, and hospitals were also built for animals. The Emperor Asoka, he practiced great compassion. He cared for animals, built hospitals for them also. And then he asked the people to plant trees by the roadside, so that when people traveled on the roads, it was not so hot. And he also encouraged the planting of medicinal plants, so that people could benefit from the medicinal plants, like neem trees and all that. And then he also had wells dug to provide water for people. He also built resting places, like nowadays we have the R&R and the highway. He also had these resting places for travelers, so that they could obtain drinking water there and have a rest. And he taught people to be obedient to parents and to respect elders and to have just treatment of all peoples, no matter their caste, no matter their level, including slaves and all that. He said that we should treat them justly. And also he gave up hunting. Kings like to go hunting, but he gave up hunting. Instead, he spent his time doing this Dhamma tours, which he enjoyed a lot. Then he put a lot of effort in governing well. He wanted to make sure that he benefited the people, like a bodhisattva, benefit the people, and in as many ways as he could. And then he also appointed ministers of Dhamma to look after the Sangha affairs, to look after the Sasana. And on top of that, he also appointed ministers who were responsible for other religions, also to take care of other religions. And then he warned against further schisms of the Sangha. He warned the monks not to create more schools, and that he would defrock monks who attempted to create a schism or who had wrong views. Okay. Now we talk about sectarian or Hinayana Buddhism. Now this sectarian or Hinayana Buddhism, most of its important doctrines occurred from the year 150 BCE until the year 150 CE. But then it became popular later, from the 50 BCE only it became popular. And this sectarian or Hinayana Buddhism is typified by the development of the scholastic Abhidhamma. Because at that time, the Sangha was very well supported. So the monks, they had a lot of time. And then many of them did a lot of studies on the Dhamma. And then they started to have new ideas about the Dhamma. This they call the Abhidhamma. The Abhidhamma, according to this book by Professor Hirakawa, is not the higher Dhamma. Abhidhamma means analysis of the Dhamma. That means they analyze the Dhamma and then they come up with new concepts. New concepts about the Dhamma that the Buddha did not teach. So, even though they knew that the Buddha's words were to be found in the suttas and the Vinaya, yet they preferred to have this Abhidhamma and all that. Also this sectarian Buddhism, Hinayana Buddhism, was more for the monks and nuns. And originally the word Savaka means disciples of the Buddha and includes monastics as well as lay people. But in sectarian Buddhism, disciples, Savakas, only meant the monks and the nuns. So this sectarian Buddhism, because they started to have ideas about this Abhidhamma, all these 18 schools of sectarian Buddhism, they had their own Abhidhamma. Every school, the Abhidhamma differed from school to school because all were new ideas. For example, in the our Theravada Abhidhamma, you find new concepts like Javana, Bhavanga, Patisandhi, Chitta, Chuti Chitta, Kalapas and all this that the Buddha did not teach. So this Theravada Abhidhamma, there are 7 books. You see, all these 18 schools, most of their doctrines were lost. Finally now we have mostly only the Theravada, and they also have the Savastivadin. So out of the 7 books, the last 3 were the Dattu Kata, Yamaka and Patana. And because these last 3 books were written later, so they were compiled later, they have a lot of new concepts. And then the later this sectarian Buddhism, they start to have other teachings. For example, the Pitaka Padesa, the Neti Pakarana, and later in the 5th century, that means 400 something, they started to write commentaries, interpretations of the suttas, their own ideas about the sutta, and this is called the Atthakatha. So the most famous of the commentators is a man called Buddhaghosa. This Buddhaghosa, he wrote commentaries. He was a great scholar. You see, the trouble with these scholarly monks, they don't practice enough. Instead of meditating, like the Buddha advised, to clear the mind and attain the jhana so that they can see clearly, these scholar monks, they keep studying and then having ideas, but their minds are not developed. So if their minds have not attained jhana, the Buddha said, they cannot see things as they really are. So they write commentaries, and this Buddhaghosa, he wrote commentaries on all the Nikayas and the Vinaya books, and he wrote commentaries on the Dhammapada, Sutta Nipata, and also another book called the Visuddhimagga. All these are later writings. So when all these later writings started to appear, people became more interested in these later books like the Abhidhamma and the commentaries. Instead of putting all the attention on the suttas and the Vinaya, now the attention, they are more interested in the Abhidhamma, not in the suttas. More interested in the commentaries than actually what the Buddha said and all these things. So that's the difference between original Buddhism and sectarian Buddhism. In other words, sectarian Buddhism created a lot of new books which did not exist before, and they preferred to study these books rather than the original words of the Buddha. This the Buddha already warned in the suttas. The Buddha warned in the Samyutta Nikaya, I think 20.7. The Buddha said in the future, the monks would not be interested in the original words of the Buddha. Instead, they will be interested in the words of disciples. And the Buddha said this will cause the disappearance of the true Dhamma. When the Buddha says the word of disciples, he means the words of later monks who write new books. Now, a lot of people don't know that there is one sutta in the Digha Nikaya. I think it's Digha Nikaya 29, where the Buddha gave a simile of the razor. The Buddha said in that sutta that the Buddha's teachings are utterly perfect and pure and complete. So the Buddha said there is no need to add to his words or subtract from his words. The Buddha said if a person adds to the Buddha's words, in other words, says more than what the Buddha says, the Buddha says that person does not understand the Dhamma. And if a person thinks that he can subtract some of the Buddha's words, he also does not understand the Dhamma. So what the Buddha is saying here is that we should only rely on his original words, not on later books. So it's because these later monks, they don't understand the Buddha's words. That's why they think they want to add to his words. They start a lot of new other books. All this is considered, this is Hinayana books, the Abhidhamma, the commentaries, the Jataka stories, the Netipakarana, the Bedako Padesa, all these books. So that's the difference between original Buddhism and Nikaya Buddhism. Now we come to Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism, most of the books were compiled from 100 BCE to 100 CE. That means around 200 years period around the 0 CE. 100 years before and 100 years after. But then they only became popular about 10 CE, 10 years of the Common Era. Now the early Mahayana teachings, they still accept that Arahatship is the ideal of the Buddha's teachings, but they try to appeal to people to consider the Bodhisattva path. For example, one of the early books called the Mahavastu. This is what they say, that Arahatship is the ideal, but then they try to persuade people to walk the Bodhisattva path. However, later Mahayana books like the Lotus Sutra, they champion the Bodhisattva path and condemn the Arahant path. So when they do that, the Arahant path is a path of mental training and self-control that the Buddha taught, that we have to discipline our mind and train ourselves to have self-control and change our character for the better, to discard unwholesome states of mind and to cultivate wholesome states of mind. But instead, this Bodhisattva path talks about paramis. This paramis was never mentioned by the Buddha in his original teachings. It is a later teaching where they speculate that the Buddha must have taken a very, very long time to become enlightened. They said that the Buddha cultivated over a period of 4 Asankheya Kapas. Asankheya means countless. So when they say 4 Asankheya Kapas, it means countless world cycles plus 100 Mahakapas. So in other words, what they are saying is, it took the Buddha an eternity of time to become enlightened. If you think that the Buddha took an eternity to become enlightened, surely we must take more than an eternity to become enlightened, isn't it? So in other words, they are discouraging you to cultivate yourself, to practice the Arahant path. So they are telling you just to practice the paramis. But then in the Buddha's teaching, there is only one path to enlightenment, the Noble Eightfold Path. There is no other path. And if you look into a Noble Eightfold Path, nothing is mentioned about parami. So you can understand from here that these are wrong teachings, because the Buddha said that his teachings are perfect and we should not add to his teachings or subtract from his teachings. Now it is said here that the early Mahayanis revived the spirit of the Buddha's teachings by adapting it for a new age. However, these innovative elements brought hidden dangers with them. As time passed on, many Buddhists became more and more interested in the new addition than in the original message of the Buddha. Magical elements played an important role in Mahayana Buddhism from the beginning, probably because they were a response to the religious needs of the common people. Perfection of Wisdom Sutras contained claims that the text could protect those who followed it. According to the Lotus Sutra, faith in the Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara, that means Kuan Yin, would protect a person from all disasters. Efficacy of the mantras was found in many Mahayana scriptures. Over the centuries, these magical formulas came to play an increasingly important role in Mahayana Buddhism until by the 6th century, esoteric Buddhism, that means the secret school, had emerged as a distinct movement and began to develop in India. So you see here, these Mahayana teachings were a response to what people wanted. That's why in Chinese they call them Hong Pian Wat Mui. So they provide what people want. People, like to pray for help, so they provide them with Kuan Yin. They say, you need anything, you just call Kuan Yin will help you. But then in the suttas, the Buddha said that what we want and is hard to get cannot be obtained by prayers or by vows or by appealing for it. The Buddha said, if you can get what you want by prayers or appeals or vows, then the Buddha said, why is there so much suffering in the world? The Buddha with his psychic eye can see that ghosts are suffering, can see that animals are suffering, hell beings are suffering. Who is helping them? They are crying out every night and sometimes even the day, crying out for help, especially like the hell beings. If there is a compassionate Bodhisattva or Buddha can help, why don't he help them? That's enough. Bring all these beings out of hell. But the Buddha says nobody can help. Our world is created by our karma, and it's also created by our mind. So the world is like a nightmare. So unless we develop our mind, we keep having nightmares. Sorry, I have all this written all over the place.